Welcome back. Now that you've seen Carthage destroyed, you may remember in our previous video that we spoke about the alliance that was made between Carthage and Macedonia and Greece. This came up in 211 BC, and it was at the instigation of the leader of Macedonia, Philip, a descendant of the original Philip of Macedon, well known for being the father of Alexander the Great. Well, there's a rule in ancient history: never ally with a loser. And the Romans took note of the alliance between Carthage, Macedonia, and Greece, and they were certain to go and punish them quite mightily for that particular alliance. There were quite a few other conflicts too between the Romans and Macedonians and Greeks as well. So it was a pretty sure bet that eventually the Romans would move in that direction. So there were in fact a series of four separate Macedonian wars, and once again we're going to have to simplify things for the purpose of this video in order to get the Roman us through this historical period. But in fact, it did take several steps before the Romans were finally able completely to take down Macedonia. Now, Macedonia is directly north of Greece, and I should clarify that it's not the area that today is called Macedonia, the Republic of Macedonia. It's the area that's a little bit further south, and it borders Greece directly before you get into Greece proper. So the Macedonians had a long and rich history of their own in their position north of Greece, and of course, when Philip of Macedon in the 4th century BC, the 300s BC, was successful at first establishing himself as Macedonian king by defeating his fellow pretenders to the throne and also engaging in a series of wars with the Illyrians, the peoples around him, Philip was able to also expand Macedonian influence both east, this way, and south, and eventually was able to take over Greece completely in 338 BC. At the Battle of Chaeronea. Philip himself was assassinated 2 years later, 336 BC, and his son Alexander was the one who reconquered Greece when they tried to revolt, and then went eastward and was able to take over all of Persia, all the way out to India. So once Alexander accomplished this, the Greek world advanced into what we now call the Hellenistic period. Now, it's in the middle of this period, in the late 200s BC, that Macedonia and Greece both ended up allying with the Carthaginians, possibly out of fear of growing Roman power. Now, the Romans, as we've mentioned, fought a series of 4 wars against the Macedonians with help of the Greeks. Now, the Greeks themselves were arranged in a series of leagues of cities all put together. The most important city in Greece at that time, at the head of one of these major leagues, was Corinth, which geographically is in on the Peloponnesus, which is the southern portion of Greece, the peninsula, and Corinth itself is near the northern part of that peninsula, where there's an isthmus, a very narrow stretch of land that connects the southern part of Greece with the northern part of Greece. That's where Corinth is, and it's the head of this league of Greek states. Okay, so the Romans pushed their way over and over and over again, step by step, into Macedonian territory. Eventually, the Romans in 197 BC were able to score one of their first major military successes against the Macedonians. And what was notable about this particular victory, it was called Kynoskephalae, which means the head of the dog in Greek, Cynoscephalae. What was notable about this victory is that the Romans were technologically superior to the Macedonians. The Macedonians themselves had made many changes to the Greek phalanx by improving, for instance, the specific weapon that they used, the much longer pike that they were able to use against the Greeks, and they also did quite a few other changes in the way that they organized the wings and the command structure of the phalanx in order to overpower the Greeks, who turned out to be outdated. However, what the phalanx had one major limitation to it: it could not handle the rank and file flexibility that the Romans were able to establish with the legions. So in time when the Romans marched their legions into Macedonia, they were able ultimately to wear down the Macedonians time and time again. And it was in fact at 197 BC that the Roman weaponry and the legionary flexibility eventually significantly overpowered the Macedonians. That, in fact, was the conclusion of one of the 4 wars. The Macedonians, however, kept on resisting. In 168 BC, finally the Romans, at the conclusion of the 3rd Macedonian War, were able to take out the Macedonian capital at Pydna, P-Y-D-N-A. Still, interestingly, though, the Macedonians weren't done yet. They had one last chance to rebel. And in the beginning of the 140s BC, the Romans made another attack, and that was the 4th Macedonian War. And finally, the Romans got Roman territory. It was right at that moment that the Greeks made one last effort to resist the Romans by themselves inciting a rebellion behind the city of Corinth. And so the Romans, who now, of course, were already there and much more powerful than they were previously, just simply made the additional step down into Greece. And in 146 BC, the city of Corinth was razed to the ground. And it's quite remarkable that the 146 BC saw this destruction of both the city of Corinth and the city of Carthage. And as a consequence, the Romans now had territorial possession over both Carthage and Greece, together, of course, with Macedonia. This was an enormous, gigantic series of successes for the Roman Republic, and it was completely unparalleled by anything that had happened historically, even with Alexander the Great, because the difficulty about Alexander the Great's expansion, even though it was quite extensive, was that it was very disorganized, and once Alexander died young, without an heir, that whole territory got broken up into a series of factions in different places, and there was a complete chaos amongst the different factions as to who was subsequently in control. The Romans, on the other hand, were much more systematic and organized in the way that they carefully expanded their power structure and military structure to be able to handle the increasing amount of territory that they came into control of. So although it would not last forever, as we well know, eventually the Roman Empire itself came to grief because it got too expanded. But for the time that they did it well, the Romans were able to secure their power very forcefully over this broadening territory. And far from weakening them, the Romans were in fact significantly strengthened by the expansion of this territory. So the Romans really powered up the Republic in a big way in this Middle Republic period. However, there were some social political consequences that came with that expansion, and that is going to be the subject of our next video. So come on right back, and we'll talk about the not so great side of Roman military expansion.